One point that was criticized in almost every Biomutant review are the controls, especially on PC. And I agree, cause the default button mapping and also some of the other settings feel really strange and it doesn't help with getting into the game. But luckily you can change all of them, and with a few tweaks here and there, the game controls will feel much better and intuitive. So in this video I will go through the settings and show you which changes I made or would highly recommend to make. If you are only looking for a specific setting, for example the button mapping, you can skip forward with the video chapters as usual. Let's start with the game settings. On top there's text and speech language and the difficulty settings that you can change at any time in case you get bored or you get stuck. And then there's auto advanced dialogues. That means you don't have to proceed through the dialogues by pressing a button, but you can still skip them. I would keep this on. The HUD scale is on 100 by default. If that's too big for you, you can turn it down to a minimum of 50 where you can barely see the HUD elements at all. I sticked to the default 100 here. Quest markers are these yellow dots that show you where to go. If you don't like that, you can turn it off over here. Same with the damage numbers and enemy indicators. Comic book effects are the boom and pow signs that appear during the fight. I'm not a big fan of it, so I turned it off, but that's of course up to you. By default it's enabled. If you don't like it as well, you know where to find it now. Remove waypoint when near might be interesting if you easily lose track of your markers and want them to be shown all the time, even if you are close. Also in this menu you can disable the compass if it's not necessary for you, and you can change if it rotates with your view or not. This option is enabled by default, so when you rotate, the needle in the middle is fixed while the compass is moving around it. If you turn off the option, then the compass is fixed but the needle turns with your view. At the camera settings you can find one option I would highly recommend to change, and that's the field of view. By default it is set to 75, and for me this feels like looking through a letter slot. I would recommend a value between 100 and 110 so you can see much more of your surroundings, which isn't only helpful while exploring but also during combat, and it doesn't feel like the camera is glued to the back of your character. Note that a higher field of view also needs more performance, so if you don't have the best PC, you might have to lower the graphics settings a little bit. The next option is camera shake, which adjusts how much your screen is shaking when you get hit in combat, for example. I turned it down to 0 because I prefer to have the lowest camera shake possible, but that's of course personal preference. Depth of field is the blurry background you have during some conversations, for example, or also the blurry landscape in the distance. If you don't like that, turn it off. Auto adjust should be turned on so the camera keeps following you and you don't have to turn it manually all the time. In the controls settings I kept sprint to toggle, so I only have to press the sprint button once instead of holding it, but some PC players might prefer to hold it, so here's where you can find the option. With the mouse settings I stick to the default options cause this is just perfect for me at 800 dpi. The only thing I turned down to 0 is the smoothing, as it produces a slight input lag and I prefer to have a direct feedback and input. But if you miss a smoother turning movement, you might be good with a value of about 50 here. The same with the controller. I also stick to the default settings here with the Xbox Series X controller. Smoothing turned down to 0 as well for a more direct input. Also you can disable controller vibration over here if you don't like any feedback. With the controller icons option you can switch between Xbox or PlayStation layout depending on the controller you are using. This is a point I would like to see in many other games as well, to be honest. At the audio tab, I only turned down the music and sound effects a little bit to give the ambience and speech a bit more space in the mix. But this depends on the speakers or headphones you use. Over here you can also adjust how often the narrator or creature is talking during explorations. If you think it's too much and it starts to get annoying, turn the frequency down. Or the other way around, if you can't get enough of the gibberish and the narrator's voice, turn it up. The video tab is mostly interesting for PC, but that depends a lot on your gear. Monitor settings are personal preference. If you have problems with tearing, turn vertical sync on. At display you can choose the amount of sharpening, and I would highly recommend to keep the default value cause everything else looks horrible. Resolution scale should be kept on 100 cause otherwise the game will start to look really blurry, and you can also limit the frame rate here if you like. For the graphics I went with default settings, which is maximum on the details and default on the advanced settings. But don't worry too much about these settings cause Biomutant doesn't have the highest requirements. I only have an average PC and it runs absolutely smooth on maximum settings. And then there's the most important tab, and that's the button mapping. For the movement, I switched Dodge to Control instead of Alt, because that's much more intuitive and easy to reach with your pinky. On Controller, I switched it to the right stick button. At the camera settings, I didn't change anything, but at Combat, at least for Controller. For PC, I only added Reload and Super Wushu to the 2 side buttons of my mouse. On Controller, I switched the melee attack from X on Xbox or Square on PlayStation to the left trigger, and then I switched Reload to X on Xbox or Square on PlayStation instead. Because that's basically the button layout most shooter games have, and that feels much more intuitive for me. On actions, I switched consumables, melee weapons, ranged weapons and transport from the keys 1 to 4 on PC to the keys 5 to 8, because you don't need to have fast access to these options except for the consumables, but with them bind to key 5 you will still have fast access. For the weapons and transport, you have enough time to press a button further away from WASD. For Controller, the only thing I changed over here is Interact to B on Xbox or Circle on PlayStation instead of Y on Xbox or Triangle on PlayStation, but that's personal preference. And now there's the ability settings, and that's why I switched the action keys for PC, because during combat you need faster access to the abilities, so I bound them to the keys 1 to 4 instead. That also means you don't have to use this horrible ability wheel, which is cool on console but not on PC, with holding the mouse wheel and then press Alt, E or space to perform an attack. With the number keys you have a direct access to all 4 abilities. By default it is bound to the keys F1 to F4, but that's not much better in my opinion, except if you have really long fingers. The only thing I changed for Controller over here is the toggle ability option to RB on Xbox or R1 on PlayStation instead of the left trigger, which was kind of a weird button mapping as well. In the menu shortcuts I didn't change anything at all. And last but not least, there is the accessibility, where you have the Auto Advanced Dialogues option again, which is the same one as over on the Game tab, and I have no clue why it is over here again. And then there's a lot of subtitle options where you can choose size, color, background color and opacity, but that's all personal preference. And that's it for today. I hope this video helps you to find the right settings for Biomutant. And if it did, be sure to drop a like and subscribe to the channel to stay tuned. Until then, thanks for watching. I'm the Catwoman and you are awesome.